December 2nd, 1949, 8 o'clock at night. Inside the T plant at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation in eastern Washington, technicians flipped a series of switches and deliberately shut down the air-scrubbing filters on the exhaust stacks. Then, they began dissolving uranium fuel rods that had cooled for only 16 days instead of the standard 83 to 101. The fuel was so fresh it was still dangerously radioactive. So hot, the workers called it green metal. Over the next 7 hours, a massive invisible plume of iodine-131 and xenon-133 poured unfiltered from the stacks into the night sky above the Columbia Basin. No sirens sounded, no evacuation orders went out. Families in Richland, Kennewick, and Pasco slept beneath a radioactive cloud they could not see, smell, or taste. None of them knew, none of them had been warned, and none of them had been asked. This was not an accident. It was an experiment. The United States government had just deliberately irradiated 250,000 of its 20 own citizens. The Hanford Nuclear Reservation sprawled across 586 square miles of high desert scrubland along the Columbia River in eastern Washington. Built in secrecy during the Manhattan Project, its reactors produced the plutonium that fueled the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. By 1949, Hanford was the cornerstone of America's nuclear arsenal, churning out weapons-grade material around the clock. The nearby towns of Richland, Kennewick, and Pasco depended on the site for jobs and economic survival. Most residents considered Hanford a point of civic pride. They trusted the government that employed them. That trust was about to be tested in ways they would not discover for nearly 4 decades. On August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic weapon at the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan. American intelligence was stunned. Estimates had predicted the Soviets were years away from a working bomb. Suddenly, the nuclear monopoly was gone, and Washington needed to know how fast Moscow could build an arsenal. The key was plutonium production. If analysts could measure the radioactive emissions drifting from Soviet reprocessing plants, they could estimate how much weapons-grade material the Soviets were producing. But first, they needed to calibrate their airborne detection equipment against a known source. They needed a controlled release of radiation. They needed a test site where the release could be measured from the air. The Air Force and the Atomic Energy Commission devised the plan together. They would process uranium fuel that had cooled for only 16 days, replicating the rush timeline the Soviets were believed to use. They would disable the exhaust filters at Hanford's T plant and release the radioactive byproducts directly into the open atmosphere. Air Force planes equipped with radiological sampling instruments would then track the plume from above, calibrating their detection methods against a source with known output. The experiment was codenamed the Green Run, after the green, short-cooled fuel at its center. It was classified from the moment of conception. The timing was deliberate. Only 3 months had passed since the Soviet detonation. The intelligence community was under intense pressure from the White House to develop reliable methods of tracking Soviet nuclear production from a distance. Satellite surveillance did not yet exist. Ground-level espionage inside the Soviet nuclear complex was extraordinarily difficult. The most promising method was atmospheric sampling, flying planes through or downwind of radioactive plumes and analyzing what the instruments captured. The Green Run would give the Air Force a controlled experiment to prove the concept. The cost, measured in curies released over American farmland, was considered acceptable. Not everyone at Hanford agreed with the plan. Herbert Parker, head of the Health Instruments Division, had spent years establishing safety protocols at the site. He understood the risks of processing green fuel with the filters off. His deputy, Karl Gammertsfelder, later told reporters that Hanford scientists recommended against the release. The weather conditions were wrong. The winds were shifting. The forecast called for atmospheric instability. According to Gammertsfelder, the Green Order came from the military. The Department of Defense, then under the authority of General Dwight Eisenhower's office, insisted the experiment proceed on schedule regardless. The experiment required specific meteorological conditions: a westerly or southwesterly wind above 200 feet, speeds under 15 miles per hour, and no rain or fog. On the night of December 2nd, the wind was blowing from the northwest, pushing the plume southeast directly over populated areas rather than over empty desert. Scientists at Hanford flagged the unfavorable conditions in writing. Records indicate the military overruled them. The dissolving began at 8 p.m. Over the next 7 hours, roughly 7,780 curies of iodine-131 and 20,000 curies of xenon-133 poured from the unfiltered stacks into a shifting, unpredictable atmosphere. The radioactive plume drifted far beyond what anyone anticipated. Wind shifts throughout the night scattered the contamination across a swath roughly 200 miles long and 40 miles wide. The Air Force planes tracking the release lost the plume as conditions changed. Monitoring stations recorded elevated readings in communities across eastern Washington. Vegetation samples collected near Kennewick showed contamination nearly 1,000 times higher than acceptable daily limits. Animal thyroid readings spiked to 80 times the tolerable dose. For context, the accident at 3 Mile Island 30 years later would release between 15 and 24 curies of radioactive iodine. The Green Run released over 7,700. In the town's downwind from Hanford, life continued as normal that December night. Farmers milked their cows the next morning. Children drank the milk at breakfast. Iodine-131 concentrates in the thyroid gland, and the pathway from grass to cow to milk to child is one of the most efficient biological delivery routes for the isotope. The smaller the thyroid, the higher the concentration per gram of tissue. Children were the most vulnerable, and no one told their parents. No advisory was issued. No milk was recalled. The families of the Columbia Basin went about their routines, unwittingly feeding their children contaminated food from contaminated land. The contamination spread farther than even the pessimistic forecasts predicted. Rain began falling across parts of eastern Washington during and after the release, washing radioactive iodine out of the atmosphere and onto the ground. Spokane, more than 100 miles northeast of Hanford, recorded measurable fallout. Walla Walla, to the southeast, was also affected. The plume did not follow a single predictable path. It fragmented, drifted, and deposited contamination wherever weather carried it. Residents in these cities had no connection to Hanford, no reason to suspect they were being exposed, and no warning of any kind. The Green Run did not even accomplish its stated objective. The adverse weather doomed the calibration effort. Wind direction changes scattered the plume in ways the Air Force sampling planes could not track. The detection instruments the experiment was designed to test produced inconclusive results. Herbert Parker's Health Instruments Division documented the excessive contamination and formally recommended the test never be repeated. According to declassified records, Parker noted that the activity levels came close enough to significant harm that his division would resist any proposed repetition. All that contamination and the intelligence data was largely useless. The Green Run was not an isolated event. It was the single largest deliberate release, but Hanford had been venting radioactive iodine into the atmosphere since the day the tea plant began operations in 1944. In the early years of production, the reprocessing plants had no stack filters at all. Between 1944 and 1947, nearly all of the site's total atmospheric iodine-131 emissions escaped unfiltered into the skies above eastern Washington. According to dose reconstruction estimates, Hanford released approximately 740,000 curies of radioactive iodine into the atmosphere between 1944 and 1957. The Green Run's 7,780 curies, staggering in isolation, was roughly 1% of that total. Throughout the late 1940s and 1950s, residents of eastern Washington noticed patterns they could not explain. Livestock died unexpectedly. Gardens produced misshapen vegetables. Families in rural communities along the Columbia saw neighbors develop thyroid problems at unusual rates. Children were born with defects that doctors could not account for. Cancer diagnoses clustered in small towns where everyone drank the same water and breathed the same air. They did not know the word downwinder yet. They had no concept of the invisible thread connecting their illnesses to the reactors humming 40 miles upwind. Tom Bailey grew up on a farm in Mesa, Washington, directly downwind from Hanford. His family drank well water, ate vegetables from their garden, and consumed milk from local dairies. Bailey later described his neighborhood as the Death Mile. Every household within a mile radius of his family's farm was touched by serious illness: thyroid disease, cancer, birth defects, or early death. Bailey himself developed health problems he attributed to radiation exposure. He spent decades trying to understand why so many people in his community were sick. The answer, when it finally came, had been classified since the year he was born. The Green Run remained classified through the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam, Watergate, and 3 Mile Island. No congressional investigation examined it. No whistleblower exposed it. The residents who lived downwind grew older, some grew sicker, and most never connected their health problems to the facility that provided their region's livelihood. Hanford employed thousands of workers across the Tri-Cities area. Questioning the site meant questioning your neighbor's paycheck and your own. Economic dependence created a silence nearly as effective as the classification stamp itself. In the mid-1980s, Karen Dorn Steele, a reporter for the Spokane Spokesman-Review, began interviewing residents in communities near Hanford. She heard the same stories repeated across dozens of households: thyroid problems, cancer, children born with serious health issues, livestock that sickened and died without explanation. Steele recognized a pattern that pointed toward the nuclear reservation. She filed a Freedom of Information Act request, joined by the Hanford Education Action League and the Environmental Policy Institute of Washington. The government resisted, arguing that releasing the documents might compromise nuclear weapons secrets. A federal court disagreed. In 1986, the Department of Energy declassified approximately 19,000 pages of historical Hanford environmental monitoring records. Karen Dorn Steele combed through them methodically. Buried in the documents was the Green Run, a detailed account of a deliberate, unfiltered release of radioactive material over an unsuspecting civilian population, authorized by the military, executed despite the objections of Hanford's own health physicists. Steele broke the story in the spring of 1986. For the first time, the people of Eastern Washington learned that their government had knowingly exposed them to dangerous levels of radiation, and then kept it secret for 37 years. Understanding the harm requires understanding the isotope. Iodine-131 is a byproduct of uranium fission. It has a half-life of roughly 8 days, meaning it decays relatively quickly but with intense radioactivity during that window. When released into the atmosphere, it settles on grass and vegetation. Cows eat the grass. The iodine concentrates in the milk. Humans drink the milk. The thyroid gland, which regulates metabolism, actively absorbs iodine from the bloodstream. It cannot distinguish between stable iodine and its radioactive counterpart. Once lodged in the gland, Iodine-131 bombards surrounding tissue with beta radiation at close range, damaging cells and DNA. A child's thyroid gland is far smaller than an adult's, roughly the size of a walnut. When the same quantity of iodine-131 concentrates in a smaller gland, the radiation dose per gram of tissue is dramatically higher. Children also drink more milk relative to their body weight than adults do. Some infants receive the isotope through their mother's breast milk. The combination of higher intake and smaller target organ meant that children living downwind from Hanford received thyroid doses several times greater than their parents. According to the Hanford Environmental Dose Reconstruction Project, estimated childhood thyroid doses range from 3 to 235 rad between 1944 in 1951. Standard procedure at Hanford required irradiated uranium fuel rods to cool for 83 to 101 days before reprocessing. During that cooling period, short-lived isotopes like iodine-131 decay to negligible levels. The green run fuel cooled for only 16 days. At that stage, the iodine-131 content was still enormously high. When the fuel was dissolved in nitric acid at the T plant, the volatile iodine escaped as gas. Under normal operations, stack filters would capture most of it before it reached the outside air. For the green run, those filters were deliberately shut off. Every safety margin that existed to protect the public was intentionally removed, one layer at a time. Hanford operated a network of environmental monitoring stations across eastern Washington. In the days following the green run, those stations recorded contamination levels that alarmed even the scientists who had expected elevated readings. Vegetation samples near Kennewick showed iodine-131 concentrations nearly 1,000 times above the permissible daily limit. Readings extended as far as the Walla Walla Valley and toward Spokane, where rain deposited fallout from the drifting plume onto streets and farmland alike. The contamination footprint covered roughly 8,000 square miles of American soil. Herbert Parker's team documented all of it, and then the documents were stamped classified. In 1987, following the declassification, Congress directed a comprehensive study to answer the question downwinders had been asking for decades. The Hanford Environmental Dose Reconstruction Project, known as HEDR, attempted to calculate how much radiation communities had actually received between 1944 and 1972. The project was initially managed by the Department of Energy, but widespread public distrust of the agency forced its transfer to the Centers for Disease Control in 1992. HEDR took 8 years to complete. Its findings confirmed what many residents had long suspected. People living in the path of Hanford's emissions had absorbed significant doses of radiation, in some cases continuously for years. After the 1986 declassification, the people who had lived downwind from Hanford finally had a name for what they were: the Downwinders. Community groups formed across eastern Washington and beyond. Tom Bailey took Karen Dorn Steele on what he called the Death Mile Tour, walking her past house after house where families had been devastated by thyroid disease, cancer, and birth defects. Bailey later testified before a Congressional Advisory Committee in 1994, presenting a hand-drawn map of his neighborhood. Every family on that map shared one common thread. They had all consumed the same water, the same milk, and the same locally grown food from the same contaminated land. Downwinder advocacy groups conducted their own health surveys across the affected region. Analyzing results from roughly 800 respondents, they compared disease rates against control populations with no history of Hanford exposure. The findings were stark. Downwinder communities reported thyroid disease rates 6 to 10 times higher than the baseline. Rates of certain cancers followed a similar pattern. These were not clinical studies with the rigor of controlled trials, and researchers cautioned against overinterpretation. But for families who had spent decades wondering why their neighbors were dying, the surveys confirmed a pattern that government studies had failed to acknowledge. In 1988, Congress mandated a formal study of the relationship between Hanford's iodine-131 releases and thyroid disease among nearby residents. The Hanford Thyroid Disease Study was conducted by the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center and the CDC. When its results were published, the study concluded that no definitive causal link could be established between the releases and thyroid disease in the study population. Downwinders were stunned and furious. Independent researchers challenged the study's methodology and sample selection. The conclusions remain contested, with critics arguing the study was designed in ways that made a positive finding unlikely. A lawsuit filed on behalf of roughly 2,300 downwind residents reached trial in a federal court in Spokane. The case had taken years to navigate procedural hurdles. The court selected 6 bellwether plaintiffs to test the legal viability of the claims before proceeding with the larger group. The jury found that 2 of the 6, both diagnosed with thyroid cancer, had more likely than not been harmed by Hanford's radiation releases. One of those plaintiffs, Gloria Wise, was awarded over $317,000. The verdicts were modest, but the precedent was not. A jury of citizens had concluded that Hanford's emissions caused cancer in the people who live downwind. The full downwinder litigation dragged on for 24 years. Most plaintiffs never saw a courtroom. Many died before their cases were resolved. The final settlement came in 2015, closing one of the longest-running environmental contamination lawsuits in American history. For many of the surviving downwinders, the resolution came a generation too late. They had spent decades fighting for official acknowledgement that their government had knowingly exposed them to dangerous radiation and then hidden the evidence. The legal system eventually gave them a fraction of what they sought, and only after most of a lifetime had passed. No government official was ever criminally charged for the Green Run. No military officer faced court-martial for authorizing an experiment that exposed 250,000 civilians to radiation. The scientists who objected were not disciplined for failing to stop it. The officials who overruled them were not disciplined for proceeding against safety recommendations. The Green Run remains the largest known deliberate release of radioactive material over an American civilian population. It was designed, authorized, and executed by the institutions that were supposed to protect the people beneath the plume. Not a single person answered for it. Today, the Hanford Nuclear Reservation is the most contaminated nuclear site in the Western Hemisphere. Decades of weapons production left behind 56 million gallons of radioactive waste stored in aging underground tanks, many of which have leaked into the surrounding soil. Cleanup efforts have been underway since the late 1980s and are expected to continue for decades more, at a cost that may exceed $100 billion. The Columbia River, which runs along the site's eastern boundary, carries trace contamination from groundwater seepage. The land that once produced the nation's nuclear arsenal now demands the nation's largest environmental remediation project. The Green Run should have been a turning point. It should have established that no government can deliberately expose its citizens to harmful radiation without their knowledge. Instead, the experiment was classified, the evidence buried, and the affected communities left to suffer in ignorance. The declassification came only because journalists and advocacy groups forced it through the courts. The health studies produced contested results. The legal settlements came a generation late. The lesson of the Green Run is not that the system eventually corrects itself. The lesson is that it took 37 years of secrecy, a reporter with an FOIA request, and 19,000 declassified pages to prove what the government knew on the night it flipped the switches. Somewhere in the federal archives, there may still be documents related to the Green Run that have never been released. The original experiment report remains partially classified. Military details about the Air Force's role in designing and authorizing the test have never been fully disclosed. The families of the Columbia Basin who buried their dead, who watched their children grow up with thyroid scars, who spent decades asking questions no one in authority would answer, may never know the complete story. Some pages, it seems, are still marked for eyes that will never read them.